Morning. Today we've got Intacct and the standard purchase requisitions workflow. We've got a lot to cover today, so it probably might take up the full hour or close to it. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to do a general overview of the purchase requisitions environment, or just what the foundation of it is. We'll look at the approval workflow, how they affect the general ledger, and then we'll get into Intacct and how we add a purchase requisition, and we'll do a regular one and a blanket purchase order one. Converting those into a purchase order, since the whole basis of our requisition workflow is to generate a purchase order. And then how we print or email those and get them out to our vendors. And at the end, we'll go through the open purchase orders and what our expectations are when we open one. So this is lifted from the accounting manual. Procurement of materials and equipment and contract services are facilitated through a purchase order system. At this point, that's Intacct. And so we include information. The manual requires what's on screen there. Obviously, we include more, but we're at least going to have our date, the vendor, the description of the item being purchased or service, the quantity, price, and line item. It's required that the request has to be legitimate, appropriate, and supported by adequate budget. It has to make sense to what the purpose of your program is. And of course, if you're governed by a federal grant and their statutes, then you'll have to meet those regulations in your request too, or to the contract requirements. The purpose of the requisition workflow is to follow the accounting manual and to ensure that the budget can be held or encumbered, committed, obligated, to prevent overspending of approved budgets. Along with the requisition workflow, blanket purchase orders are allowed and they can be used. If we're going to do it for 1 month or the entire year, that's basically the preference of the program director. So we're not limited to having to do one PO every month. If we have recurring things like our utility payments, we could do a blanket purchase order and we'll work from that. So we'll look at opening one of those. This is the rules for how or why we have to use a purchase requisition. Functionally, up to $800 of purchase orders required. Vendor selection is the discretion of the program director. No bid requirement is necessary. So that means there's no other attachments that's going to be needed to support the spending of this other than an EPLS that tells us the vendor's not excluded from receiving money by the federal government. Where we start having to have additional documentations at the $1,200 level, where a purchase order is required, written bid on letterhead is required. So once we start spending $1,200 or more, we're going to need a quote that justifies exactly that. So if we're buying office supplies and we're spending $1,200 on printer ink, then at $1,200 we would need the quote with the vendor letterhead on there saying exactly what it is. Then of course at $10,000 or more documentation gets added, since now we have to get council approval. So we're going to have a resolution and proof that we've put these things out for bids. All right, so let's look at what the approval workflow is. The purchase requisition workflow starts with a user creating the purchase requisition. When we submit it, it goes to our program approver. They have two decisions to make: approve or decline. If they approve, it goes forward. If they decline, it goes backwards, back to the user to address whatever the reason for the decline is. The approval from the program approver has no effect on our general ledger. So that's not going to affect our expenses and it's not going to affect our encumbrances. That then goes to the program monitor, who has the same decision to make: approve or decline. Any decline goes all the way back to the user. If they approve, it still goes to the user, but this time it's approved and the general ledger is affected because now we've created an encumbrance. And that's what this workflow looks like in a table. The user submits, the state goes to submitted whenever we create and submit one. No effect on our general ledger, so there's no debits or credits. Program approver reviews. Before they make a decision, it's going to say submitted. If they decline, the state of that request goes to declined. The user's notified and they can make the adjustments and resubmit it if they need to. If they approve, the document would now say partially approved in the workflow at the purchase requisition list screen. So anytime we see a purchase requisition that says partially approved, we now know we have our program director approval. We're waiting for the monitor to approve. And then finally, the monitor, before they approve, it's going to say partially approved until they make one of those two decisions. If they decline, it says declined. If they approve, that document updates to pending. The user is notified, and now they can make the next step, which is to convert that into a purchase order. And then we have the entry that is actually made, where we have our line item will be debited with whatever the amount is in the request, and our encumbrance is created. So as we're doing this, budget is verified when a user submits a purchasing transaction. So while we're preparing our request, are we verifying that the line item for the funding source has the funds available to accommodate your request? Upon submission, remember, budget is not affected. Budgets are affected when the request is fully approved. So it's important to understand this, because you can submit multiple requests that meet an existing budget individually, but in totality may exceed the total balance. And we don't know that until after an approval is made, and then the documents after that start getting declined because they don't meet the budget. So keep that in mind when preparing your requests. The general ledger is not affected until the request is fully approved. If your purchase requisition says submitted, partially approved, declined, or drafted, there's no effect on your budget. They haven't been posted to anything. It has to say pending, meaning it's been fully approved. Once a purchase rec is fully approved, a journal entry is initiated automatically by Intacct. The amount that gets recorded includes the amount of your request. And then each line entry in our request is tracked separate from the other. So if we have a requisition with 2 lines, the encumbrances are tracked separately for each of those lines. So it's important in monitoring and ensuring future documents maintain the formatting you've started with. If we have a requisition with 2 lines and we convert that into a purchase order with 2 lines, when we prepare to make a payment, we need to make sure both of those lines eventually get paid or closed so that the encumbrance will release properly. Once a commitment is recorded, the commitment will remain on the books and will be included in determining budget availability until the program takes action by either paying it or closing the purchase order. And then just to rehash what the journal entry looks like, there it is again. When we get a requisition approved, the encumbrance journal has an entry posted which debits our expense account we're using, and it's going to credit an account called encumbrance control. And then here's the table of the whole requisition workflow. The purchase requisitions, the document that creates a commitment. Once the state says pending, there's that journal entry. When we convert a requisition into a purchase order, there is no effect on our general ledger. That purchase order document simply exists for us to be able to print the official purchase order for the tribe that we can provide our vendors. So regardless of its status, the document itself does not affect our general ledger. What we convert it to does. If we make a payment where they're converting it to a voucher or justification, that's when our general ledger gets impacted and the encumbrance can get released. And the same thing with closing a purchase order. If we convert a PO into a closed purchase order, it's the closed purchase order that releases our encumbrance. So if we see our purchase orders have pending, partially converted, draft, or in progress, that's our signal to us that encumbrances exist, okay? So the user account I'm using today is a demo user, so it has access to just one funding or one program and checkbook. So every action I'll be taking today, any user can replicate exactly what I'm going to be doing. So all our purchase requisitions will always be in the purchasing menu under quote purchase requisition. If we're going to add one, we can click the plus sign to go right to add, or if we click the standard purchase requisition text, it takes us to the list of our transactions. I'm using a test fund, so it has no transactions, so there's nothing to be listed. And now we're going to go ahead and start on working to add one. The very first field we need to look at, what happens when we go here, is our cursor's in the date field. It's going to default to today and most of our activities to today, so that's fine. But every now and then, we'll have somebody start looking for a vendor before changing where the cursor is. And so with that in there, the cursor in this field, a lot of our vendors start with R if I was looking for Rosebud Office Supply. R is a shortcut key in Intacct that keys to the last day of the year. So by doing that, I changed the date to December. And so I might hit the R and realize, oh, it's not coming up. So now I have to start typing for the vendor without realizing I've changed the date. So you want to be really careful of that. There's a handful of keys. I think H is another one I've seen recently happening where we're putting things out there. Like we had it as today and I type an H, that's the last day of the month. And so we're probably not looking at that too much in the approval process. The monitors are likely not looking at this corner. But what would happen is if we approved it with whatever date is there, the encumbrance that eventually posts will post to that date. And in the slide deck, one of the slides has a list of all the shortcut keys that affects the next area we need to be aware of is this vendor field. We all have to use a vendor. If it's not business related, meaning it's not an expense for the office when we're paying an employee or paying a person who has an employee ID, we're not going to use the employee ID. The employee ID would be for something like mileage, or we're reimbursing them for the cost they had for the office. That's not something we would use if we're paying them or paying somebody who's a contractor or we're acquiring something from them. We're going to use a vendor ID, not their employee ID. And so it's as easy as, of course, typing in a vendor name, starting Intacct reads it left to right. So whatever we type, it's going to start shortening up to matching whatever we're entering as we go along. Businesses are going to be in there, their normal name, Rosebud Office Solutions. But people are going to have their names in their last name and then first name. So that could be hard to find. So if we were looking for a vendor ID for me, we see 2 employee IDs for Moran, but we don't see a vendor ID. If we're unsure of whether or not the person has a vendor ID, before we go out there and request a new ID, we can use the find button to look for this person. So let's look for Rosebud Building Products. If we knew the word building was in their name, and so I type build and hit enter, Rosebud Building Products is not going to come up because Intacct's reading our vendors or whatever we're typing from left to right. And we might not know the full name or how that is ordered, so our search might not be completely helping us find the person or the business. So if we come to the vendor box and we look and we find it, we still need to find Rosebud Building Products. If I type a %, then start typing building or build and hit enter, it's going to bring up an instance of where the word building appears in the vendor's name no matter where it appears. So we have one company where building is the first part of the name. So if we start typing building, it's going to come up. But because we made building a wild card word in the vendor name, it comes up for all instances. And now we would see there's Rosebud Building Products. So before we ask the revenue office for a new vendor, give that an extra look to make sure that we just don't have the name entered correctly. And especially for people, if we're paying an individual, the juniors and seniors can be entered by whoever requested the vendor the first time a little wonky. Sometimes it'll be Moran, comma, for, comma, Lewis, or Moran, comma, Lewis for, or the junior, seniors, that kind of stuff. So that might be hard to determine, but coming into the find the vendor box and doing the percentage sign Moran or Lewis or building, whatever it is going to help us find that if it wasn't entered the way we expected it to be. Once we have our vendor selected, this pay to, return to stuff is going to auto-populate with the information related to their account. It means we can now move on to this middle area, the header section. And what we're looking for is, in this particular area, we have payment terms, which big picture means nothing to us as a required field. So I think it defaults to net 60 for all this stuff in the purchase requisitions. This expiration date is built on that payment term. So as long as these things are populated, we're happy. If we change that to net 1, that doesn't mean the monitor is going to review your stuff and get it done in a day. This is just a required area of Intacct for the way it's used for other companies, not for ours. Reference field. If there's information you need to communicate about your purchase requisition that isn't going to make sense on the line entry or anywhere else, you can use the reference field for this. I think some of the program monitors are asking for people to type their funding source in the reference field to help them search for it in the approval workflow. So you might put your funding source here. Vendor document number is an important document when we're paying, not when we're making a request yet. So this field isn't required and doesn't need to be used yet. Message is going to be the same thing as reference. If there's something we're communicating, we certainly can put it in the message field. Authorized purchaser, if we're sending somebody actually into a store and you want their name on the purchase order so they run to Turtle Creek or Allstop or wherever, add their name here and that name will print on the purchase order. The attachment field, though, is the next part we need to be concerned with. Depending on the amount we're spending, we may have to include the quote on a vendor letterhead or proof that we have obtained council approval if it's over $10,000. But one thing we know we'll have to add is the EPLS is testing vendor excluded by the federal government from receiving dollars. Most commonly, people are using the OIG Office of Inspector General website. The link is up there, oig.hhs.gov. If we go to the home page, there's an exclusions tab, and we can search their database. Are we looking for an individual or an entity? Well, this testing vendor happens to be a business, so we're going to search for an entity. And functionally, you want to look for whatever the vendor name is. That's the search we're going to have here on the page. No results are found, which is what we want. If there's a result found that's telling us that that person's been excluded by the federal government from receiving certain types of funds, we want to see this so we can print this page and save it as a PDF so we can have it as an attachment. One thing about saving your attachments, and I know that especially for the people that approve, and if you have to come back and look at them later, use a naming convention that actually makes sense to other people. If we scan documents, most of the time we get like a scanned serial number that makes no sense to anybody but the machine you used. Make it make sense to someone who's reading these things so that they know what it is. So in this case, I might have the vendor name, today's date, and that it's an EPLS. Real easy for wherever we're going to attach to this, that person knows that that's the document they expect to see, and they don't have to guess based on all the serial numbers from our scans, okay? So now that we're on the attachments side, we're ready to add one attachment. Multiple ways to attach. You can drag and drop from your screen. You can just drag it and drop it. That's the easiest way to add any attachments to your request. Your other options to hit the drop-down box. If there's nothing there, we can hit add, which gives us to the new, now we're going to create a new attachment. Browse, find it on your desktop. and add the request. And we can give this a name if we wanted to give the attachment a name. Otherwise, it's going to use the first attachment as the name. And just like the payment terms and expiration date, payment priority is basically a meaningless field too. So regardless of what we select here, normal, low, high, or urgent, that doesn't affect where it gets listed on the approval screen for anybody. So we've got our header information, we've got our date, our vendor, our attachment. Now we're ready to enter a line item. So of course we need to know, you need to know where you're going to charge the funds to. My program only has one program and checkbook, so I've got that in there. And then there's a handful, there's 2 funding sources. I've got the one picked. It's going to be office supplies, class, regular, ARPA, vaccine, CARES, that kind of stuff. What is the description of what we're purchasing here? Maybe it's ink pens or whatever, the serial number from the catalog, that kind of stuff we're going to put. And this request costs $10. $10 request wouldn't need a quote, so we don't need to worry about adding a quote. If I use the Show Spend Insight button at this point, it's going to tell me program, checkbook, funding source, the account number, what its current budget is, how much has actually been charged against it so far, what the current open purchase orders are, and then what this purchase totals and what the result would be to the budget whenever this one gets approved. If we were making a request that's going to exceed the budget, so let's say this was $110 instead of $100, we might try submitting and get this error message on the screen. Reduce your transaction or contact your budget administrator. Budget administrator isn't me, isn't the program monitor, it's you or whoever's responsible for your budget for your program. That's telling you you're exceeding your budget. Your next step when getting this error is either run a financial report or click Show Spend Insight. And you'll have all the information you need to know, which is on your budget of $100, this $110 purchase would put you $10 over. So now we know either we need to amend the request we're making, I don't need $110 worth of ink pens, or I need to prepare a change request in Martis to make sure there's enough budget available to allow my request to go through. But we're going to do $10. And so once we have all that information ready, we're ready to submit. So now we finally have something on our list screen. If we're at the default list screen, we don't get as much information in there. We get this stuff here. We can still see it says submitted, not approved yet. Or you can use the all button here that gives you a list of different types of views you can use. So I was using the created by view, which adds this dollar amount and who the user was. If we were going to do this $10 request as a purchase order, a blanket purchase order, we're going to go through the same steps. We have our testing vendor. We're going to add our attachment. There's the EPLS for that. I know what funding source I'm going to use, so I'm just going to skip entering a program and checkbook. There's my office supply line. So maybe it's going to be a monthly order of ink pens, right? We go through a lot of ink pens. If it's still going to be $10 and it's going to be $1 a month worth of ink pens, if we want this to be a blanket purchase order, so we want to be able to pay multiple times from it, you know, with March, April, May, and so on, we're going to put the value of this request in the quantity field. And we want price to be $1. Don't try to get fancy by saying, oh, there's 7 months, so I'm going to do $10 worth at 7 months to be $70. If the price changes while you're doing this, paying it and then trying to figure out how that changed and how it affects your encumbrances is going to be a pain. Just do the full value in the quantity field. Don't do it any other way if we're doing a blanket purchase order. And if I click Show Spend Insight, the other request wasn't approved yet, so that's still not listed on committed expenditures. So if we're doing multiple requests, until they get approved, it's your responsibility to be tracking your requests until they get approved and then affect your budget. So we should be aware that I could sit here all day and submit $10 requests. Intact's going to let that be submitted. But until they start getting approved and our general ledger gets affected, that's when those ones afterwards may start getting declined because the people trying to approve are going to start getting error messages because it's now going to exceed the budget. So keep track of what your requests are until they get approved, and then you'll know they'll be on our budgets where you can see them on things like Spend Insight, okay? So here we are with the blanket purchase order request. And they both say submitted. Meaning the program approver has to approve. So I'm texting that person so they can approve. While we wait for that to be approved, we're going to run our financial report so we can keep an eye on what's happening to our encumbrances. So I'm going to the reports and then to Report Center. This is a 1-year fund, so we're only looking, you could look at fiscal year if it's a 1-year fund. You may have to look at life to date if this thing spans more than 1 fiscal year. This happens to span more than 1 fiscal year, so I'm going to run that report with my program, my checkbook, and then the funding source I'm using in this request, which is the test for training. And we'll let that run. So the first person's approved. So if I refresh our purchase requisition screen, state has changed from submitted to partially approved. If I click on partially approved, that's going to take us to the page that has the approval history. I can see my assigned approver has given the approval. It's now submitted to value approval, which means program monitor. Here's that financial report. We're using office supplies, no encumbrances. Both have had 1 approval, but they haven't been fully approved, so this isn't affecting our budget yet. I just got email saying those 2 requests are approved. I'm gonna refresh the screen. We'll see what happens to the state here. They now say pending, so we know they're fully approved. And if I refresh the screen with our report, it'll rerun with what we've entered. There's our encumbrance. Now we know that any new request we make, that budget's going to be affected by it. So let's get a vendor in there and let's do a line in entry and say this request is $85. So if I hit Show Spend Insight, there are those 2 approved requests now. If I had submitted this as the 3rd request, Tracy would be getting an error message saying she can't approve it because of now when it exceeds the budget. And that works like that for any request in Intacct that verifies budget. Travel, purchase requisitions, contracts, any of those will work the exact same way. All right, so now we have our purchase requisitions fully approved. These aren't the official document we can give to a vendor. If I tried to print this, it's kind of like this just generic looking page. Our official POs are red and have the signature of the treasurer on there. So this isn't the official one. So our responsibility now as users, now that we've gotten notified, they're approved, they're ready for us, they're pending, we should be coming here to convert these into a purchase order. So on screen, I'm using a custom view. So my convert button's on the far right of the screen. If we're at the original view, the convert button's on the left of the screen. So it doesn't matter what side it's on, it's going to work the same. So we're going to convert this one into a purchase order. While converting into a purchase order, do not make any changes to this document at this point. This blanket purchase order here, if we made the mistake of thinking, well, we're just going to pay that $1 order for the month of March, we're leaving the other $9 back in the requisition, and we won't be able to access that anymore. And to top it off, the rest of the encumbrance can't release. So we're kind of creating a small nightmare for you in the short term and an accounting nightmare for your program in the long term. So make no changes during this conversion part. We're just going to post it. Now we're back in the requisition, or back in the purchase order screen. So now I need to go back to the purchase requisitions, and I can convert this into a purchase order. Before I do, if you don't like having to hop screens every time you convert a document, you can make a change to your user preferences. So if I go to click on my name in the upper right corner and then go to my preferences, then get to a list of all your stuff, right? Your security passwords, all these different things, what you're using for two-step verification. You can change your password, update your phone numbers, or whatever you're using to get the verification codes. You can do it on your own. If you want an email signature when you email stuff through Intacct, type one up. It's right here, almost at the very bottom. Display option after posting a converted transaction. Do we want to list the converted from transactions? Like in this instance, do I want to stay at the requisition screen instead of moving forward to the PO screen, especially if we have multiple documents? Or do I want to go forward with the document I'm converting? Depending on the activity you do, one or the other may be more convenient or not. I like to stay on the screen that I was working on, not the one I want to go forward to yet, especially if I have multiple things I'm working on, like in this instance with those two. So I'm going to change it to list the converted from transactions, and we'll click save. So now we can go back to our purchase requisition screen. And we have this one to convert. So this last one, when I converted, we popped over to purchase order. Now when I convert this to a purchase order, still not making any changes on screen. I've stayed on the requisition screen. So if I had more work to do, I don't have to keep going forward and then coming back to there to convert the next thing over and over again. I'm here and I can keep converting and working. Okay. And of course you can change that as you're working to fit whatever you're doing during the day or during the moment. So now we have our two requisitions. We need to get these off, the purchase orders off to our vendors. So purchase orders are under purchasing order, purchase order. And we have our two documents here. And we have different options. We can print or email individually right here. So if I hit print now, there's that purchase order. We can see all the red. There's the signature of the treasurer. This is our formal official one. If I had an authorized purchaser, their name would be right there in the middle. And then of course, there's what I said, I was buying the ink pens. Program, our funding source. So that's the information we would send forward. We can do that by printing, or we can email this document. So if I hit email, a little box pops up with more information. If the vendor has an email linked to their account, that will fill in here. If not, you're going to have to enter that person's email in there. So I linked one to the testing vendor account, so there's their email. Is there anyone you're copying or blind copying? And most importantly, who is the email from? It's going to default to me as the administrator and default contact for Intacct for the Rosebud Tribe. So even though I'm using my demo account, it's popping up with this stuff, which is my normal user account. You will need to make this change here if you're going to email a PO to somebody. If not, what ends up happening is your vendors start contacting me for questions, and then I have to figure out who it's for, let them know they've contacted the wrong person even though they got the email from me according to Intacct, and then delay any questions they might have. So just make sure you use your information here before you click OK. As soon as we put this information in and click OK, Intacct will process your request and email it to your vendor, okay? If we have multiple purchase orders we want to send and not have to go through the print email stuff, go to purchasing, go to print or email transactions, update this information, who's sending this stuff, what period of time are we sending these purchase orders for. So I'm gonna use just current month, that's all we're using. Previously sent means if you've printed it or tried to email it before, we need to include those. So that's what I just did with those documents. If I didn't check this, our request might come up blank. So I'm gonna include that. And testing vendor, because that's the vendor I'm gonna do the activity with. You could leave it blank if you wanted everybody. There's a certain line item we're trying to send POs for, then use the line item. Do we want to send posted only or drafts? Obviously only the posted ones, not our draft ones. And there's some programs that have custom purchase order templates. They could select that here and go, like IT has their own, the CARES office has one for Motorola. Otherwise we leave it blank for the rest of us. And when I click view, here are those two POs. And I can just click that email button and hit print/email, off they'll go, and it only took me one try instead of multiple times if it's gonna be multiple POs. And you can do that for more than one vendor, so you could take care of all this simultaneously, okay? Now let's look at making a payment with our blanket purchase order. All right, so we're gonna make a payment on this blanket purchase order. We've spent our $1 for the month. Now we're ready to pay for the month of March. Whether we're working on this part of the document or we're out on the list, if we're inside here, we can click more actions, convert to voucher. Or we can go back to the list screen and hit convert and choose voucher. So that decision's up to you on however easy it is for you to work. I'm already in the document, so I don't want to back out and then convert. So I've got the option here. I'm gonna choose voucher. Now that we're gonna submit a payment, we can make some changes to this document. Most notably, we're gonna make several. Vendor document number is required at this point. If you have a vendor invoice and it has a number on it, use that. That's an easy thing to refer to when going back to research your payments. So if I had an invoice and that was the number, maybe that's what I'm going to use. It has to be unique to the vendor, so we can't repeat any previous things we've used. So the invoice numbers typically are a pretty good thing to use. We have to make an update to our attachments. We have that EPLS. Now we're going to have an invoice for that one ink pen, right? We can drag and drop from the screen if we have an invoice. So if this tax exempt doc was our dollar invoice, I've got it attached along with the EPLS. If we're going to add an attachment by using the drop-down box, click the drop-down box. Do not use add. If you use add, it's going to replace the original attachment that started. We want to use the word view. Here's our list of attachments. At the end of the year, you're going to be asked to use a current or prior year to designate this to help us identify what fiscal year this stuff should be posted to. And now we can change our quantity field to be $1 because we're paying that one. And I might add to the memo field, and we can submit this for payment. The one regular purchase order we opened still pending because we have done nothing to it. But now this purchase order is partially converted because we've converted part of that quantity field into a voucher. If I view this document, Right here, I can now see that a new column was added. We started with 10, we converted 1. So we know there's still 9 available. Intacct is not going to automatically close this for us. This purchase order will remain open until you do something with it, until you fully exhaust that quantity field when it comes to a blanket purchase order. So if we're still using it next month, great. If we're done using it, and now we're not going to buy ink pens anymore, we have a responsibility to come back and close it. Intact's not going to do it for us. You've told it what to do. Now we need to tell it what to do again. The other amount, if we were going to send this forward, so instead of the quantity field having our total value, it's in the price field. If we're making our payment and it's $2 worth of pens, when I do that, that change to converted, it's closing the purchase order for us. So we don't have to do more things when it's a regular purchase order. We do have to keep an eye on what's happening to our blanket purchase orders. So if I was through, the remaining balance of $9 on this purchase order needs to be closed out by me, I can convert this, choose close partial PO. It's going to automatically update with the balance that's available. So it's got 9 and I can post this. It's going to give me a message to make sure I'm in the right fiscal year for the date I'm using, and then just click it again to move past that message. Now they both say converted. So with our open purchase orders, we have a responsibility when it comes to like the super circular, the federal rules for governing our spending for grants and contracts, that our financial reports have to be accurate and current and complete. So that's doing things like closing our purchase orders. Records must contain information pertaining to federal awards, authorization, financial obligations, unobligated balances, assets, expenditures, and so on. So we have a responsibility, not just because we want things to say converted or not, because that's our job. We have to have accurate and complete and current financial records. Our tribal accounting manual says we have a responsibility to produce an outstanding PO report on a monthly basis and agree those encumbrances to the financial report. That's our opportunity to look for that $20 in encumbrances I opened up and make sure, is that current? Are those things I have to pay, or are those things I need to close? We have to research any purchase orders that are over 60 days old and cancel those purchase orders that are no longer valid, with the exception being blanket purchase orders that we might be using for a period longer than a month, since they can be open for up to a year, okay? So keep that in mind when doing our requisitions, that we do have a monthly responsibility to make sure our requisitions and our purchase orders are open when they're supposed to be and then are closed when they need to be. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.